Robin Gibb's voice did something most voices never managed. It made you feel like you were overhearing something private, something not quite meant for the room. That trembling vibrato carried the weight of a man who understood loss before most people his age had any reason to. And that understanding, it turns out, was never just emotional. It was inherited, physical, and quietly written into his body long before the world ever heard his name. He was born on the Isle of Man on December 22nd, just minutes before his twin brother Maurice, into a household where music was already the dominant language. His father played drums, his mother sang, and the Gibb home ran on harmony the way other families ran on routine. Long before any record label had heard their names, Barry, Robin, and Maurice were already refining their sound in bedrooms and backyard performances, driven by something that went beyond ambition. Music was simply what the Gibb brothers did, the way other families attended church or watched football together on weekends, and the discipline they built during those early years would carry them further than any of them fully imagined. What separated Robin from the earliest days was tone. Barry commanded. Maurice balanced. Robin confessed. His voice carried an inward quality, fragile on the surface but deeply controlled underneath, and listeners responded without always being able to explain why. When the family relocated from Manchester to Australia, Robin was still barely a teenager, but audiences at talent shows and local television appearances noticed him immediately. The recognition arrived quickly. The emotional preparation for what followed never quite did. Returning to England as young men, the Gibb brothers walked into a music scene still living in the long shadow of the Beatles' revolution, and the industry was not especially welcoming to newcomers. That changed fast. Their manager, Robert Stigwood, signed them almost immediately after a first meeting, convinced the group carried something genuinely different from everything else competing for attention at the time. New York mining disaster 1941 landed with such an unusual somber tone that radio listeners assumed it was an unreleased Beatles recording, and that confusion opened every door available. Massachusetts followed, with Robin's voice front and center, and then I've Got to Get a Message to You and I Started a Joke, each one deepening the emotional signature he had been quietly building since childhood. He was praised constantly for how he sang. What he actually wanted to say felt, to everyone around him, like a secondary concern. The tension inside the Bee Gees accumulated slowly, and then all at once. Barry's role as primary songwriter and public face of the group expanded steadily throughout their rise, and Robin found himself celebrated for his instrument while his own creative instincts were quietly sidelined. The schedule left no space to process any of it, recording sessions bleeding into promotional appearances, bleeding into relentless travel, week after week, month after month. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, Robin had made a decision that genuinely stunned the music industry. He left the group, not as an act of rebellion, but as something closer to self-preservation. Solo work validated him almost immediately. Saved by the Bell reached near the top of the charts, and the album Robin's Reign confirmed that his voice could carry a record entirely on its own. Critics responded warmly, noting a vulnerability in the solo material that felt more exposed than anything the Bee Gees had released together. And yet the applause revealed something uncomfortable. Without Maurice close by, without the daily texture of working alongside his twin, the creative process felt unmoored in a way Robin had not anticipated. Freedom, it turned out, had a hollow quality he had no framework for handling. The media framed his departure as temperamental and self-serving, and that narrative followed him persistently, adding external pressure to a decision made out of genuine emotional necessity rather than ego. What he had wanted was space to breathe inside the group. What he got, instead, was isolation from it. The reunion brought the brothers back together, but cultural relevance took longer to recover. By the mid-1970s, the Bee Gees were releasing material and completing tours without the momentum they had once taken for granted. That shifted when they relocated to Miami and began working with a rhythm-driven approach built around groove rather than orchestration. Jive Talkin' signaled the change clearly, and when Robert Stigwood approached them about writing music for a film centered on New York's underground dance culture, they initially pushed back. Stigwood kept pressing. Saturday Night Fever became one of the best-selling soundtracks in recording history, reshaping pop music culture almost overnight and placing the Bee Gees at the absolute center of the disco era's peak moment. Robin's contribution to that soundtrack tends to get undervalued in retrospect. Barry's falsetto became the defining sound of that cultural moment, and that assessment is fair. But How Deep Is Your Love and More Than a Woman leaned heavily on Robin's ability to soften the edges of the material, adding emotional weight that kept the songs from becoming purely physical experiences on the dance floor. Without that gravity underneath, the record dances, but it doesn't endure across decades. The workload attached to that level of success was relentless, in a way nobody built any system to manage. Recording sessions ran into production work for other artists, which ran into tours, which circled back into the studio, and none of it came with recovery time built in. His marriage fractured under constant absence and exhaustion. Sleep became unreliable. His perfectionism, which had always driven him toward precision in the studio, began turning inward, feeding self-criticism and physical depletion rather than craft. The fall came at a speed that mirrored the rise. Disco collapsed culturally almost overnight, and the backlash landed hardest on the Bee Gees because they had been placed most visibly at the center of it. Radio quietly pulled their songs. Critics reframed the entire body of work as excess. Robin turned back to solo recordings, releasing material that proved he could still connect with listeners, but the emotional cost of watching the world reject music, he had genuinely poured himself into reopened wounds that had never fully closed. His first marriage ended. A pattern of amphetamine use, initially tied to surviving the relentless schedules of their peak years, became a more dangerous form of escape during this period. Throughout all of it, the bond with Maurice remained the one fixed point. They steadied each other through substance dependence, through public rejection, through the particular loneliness of watching a career contract after it had already touched extraordinary heights, and that steadiness between them was its own kind of survival. Dwina Murphy brought something different into Robin's life, a stability rooted in shared interests in history, art, and spirituality, rather than the machinery of the music industry. The chaos of earlier years softened around the relationship, but the body had been keeping its own record of everything. The abdominal pain began years before any formal diagnosis. Robin worked through it the way he had worked through most difficulties, treating the distress as something to manage around rather than investigate directly. Emergency surgery eventually revealed a blocked intestine, the same condition that had taken Maurice years earlier, and that parallel carried an emotional weight that went far beyond the medical reality. Maurice's death had already left something permanently altered in Robin. He had said publicly that without all three brothers, the Bee Gees could no longer exist the same way, and he meant every word of it. From that point forward, he moved through his days with a quiet urgency, as if time had become something he could hear, ticking in a way others in the room simply could not. Colorectal cancer followed, aggressive and already spreading when detected. Robin downplayed the severity in public statements, focused on completing a classical composition he had been writing alongside his son, and made appearances when his body would allow it. Chemotherapy stripped his weight and his energy, but not the drive to finish what he had started. Pneumonia eventually put him into a coma. He regained consciousness briefly, which felt like a door opening again, and then the door closed permanently. Robin Gibb died surrounded by his family, leaving behind unfinished melodies and a silence that felt genuinely unnatural for a man whose voice had always filled whatever space it entered. After his death, medical findings confirmed what his life had suggested without spelling out. The congenital intestinal condition that had likely caused him pain for decades was the same one that had killed Maurice. The tragedy was not coincidence. It was inherited, written into the shared biology of the twins from the very beginning, a pattern that only became fully visible when it was already too late to alter. One by one, the brothers had been taken by forces entirely outside their control, leaving only Barry behind to carry the harmony alone. Robin Gibb spent his life making music that outlasted every trend it was connected to, and he spent much of that same life carrying something heavier than the audiences celebrating him ever suspected. His voice was the most honest thing about him, and it said exactly what he could not.